I spent 25 years keeping their lives afloat, paying their debts with my inheritance and my weekends with their weddings and anniversaries. But the day they booked a European anniversary cruise and left my name off the guest list, everything changed. My name is Vivian, and I am 58 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to... They say marriage is 70-30, give or take, but mine was a long ledger I kept in my head. I remember the first time I paid off my sister-in-law Claire's credit card. She'd called in a panic about a maxed-out balance from dress fittings for a charity gala. I wrote her a check and told myself it was temporary. Then there was Tom's second mortgage scare, their daughter Zoe's dentist emergency, a last-minute flight for Mark when his job demanded he be in New York. Each temporary became a pattern. My inheritance tended to other people's mistakes, and my weekends tended to other people's celebrations. A new event arrived in the form of an invitation I'd stamped and mailed every summer for 2 decades, the family reunion at the old summer house. I organized everything, the caterer with the lemon tart my mother loved, the florist who could make peonies look like they'd been grown on our lawn, the photographer who knew how to get my husband to stop squinting. I coordinated hotels, bought extra linens, and yes, paid the deposit for the weekend yacht trip they'd all insisted on that first year. People laughed that I was family logistics. It sounded kinder than accounts payable. I kept the receipts in a slim leather folder in the top drawer of my desk, a habit that felt like my only control. There were nights I lay awake, calculating who I had covered twice that month, and wondering how my own retirement account had become a bank for other people's comforts. The family never asked for returns. They asked for explanations when I hesitated. "Viv, don't worry about it," my husband Ben would say, with that practiced softness wives learn to trust. He was the diplomat when they needed one, and the man who asked for explanations only when someone else stopped smiling. Another memory arrived, quiet and ordinary. The summer our backyard fence broke, and Ben insisted he could handle it. He didn't. I arranged for a handyman and paid him because by then, paying had become an act of avoiding fights. Once, at my insistence, we drafted a joint plan for my finances. He patted my hand and promised to look into it. Looking into it meant reminding me to relax while he handled the fun stuff. Investments he would talk about at dinner parties. He never asked to see the leather folder. When the custom yacht entered the picture, it was supposed to be a symbol of family summers, not a title dispute. My mother died 2 years after we got married and left me a modest but meaningful inheritance. Enough, I decided, to buy something we could all enjoy. I paid for the boat in full, with money in my name. I told only Ben and the captain. People assumed it was a family asset. That was the point. We used it every summer. It carried nieces to snorkeling trips and old friends to quiet coves. But legality sat quietly in the safe deposit box. The title, the purchase contract, the insurance, all in my name. I never waved it around. I never boasted. I have never liked theatrics. The little daily slights accumulated. At dinner parties, I would clear plates while Claire told a story someone else had already told. And when I corrected a detail, I'd get a smile and a diffusing hand on my elbow. Someone once left a voicemail at 2 a.m. asking me for a loan. They never said please. At family gatherings, my jokes were met with polite silence until Ben told them, and then everyone laughed. I learned to take up less space. It was quieter that way, and quieter cost me less in confrontation. A new event in the rhythm appeared late one week when Ben forgot our anniversary. He didn't forget because he was busy. He forgot because he expected me to book it, plan it, and then forgive him if it wasn't perfect. I didn't shout. I made myself a proper cup of tea and stewed quietly, noting how many times I had smoothed over similar sins. That same night, as I was putting the leather folder back, I overheard a message on the machine from Claire arranging dates for an anniversary cruise to celebrate Ben's parents' 40th. Her voice was bright and certain. The message ended with, "And how's Vivian? She'll probably love it, right? Always up for whatever." I froze over the sink, teacup in my hand, and for a moment hoped they were joking. A few days later, a small envelope slid through the mail slot with crisp edges and foreign imagery, brochures for a Mediterranean cruise. I opened it at the kitchen island and scanned the glossy booklets. There were names on the guest list scrawled in handwriting I recognized. Ben, Claire, Tom, Mark, the usual crew. My name was missing. At the bottom of the itinerary, someone had penciled a number that looked like a cabin assignment, Suite A. I felt the rustle of old receipts in my hands, the weight of every check I'd written. It wasn't that they hadn't invited me. They had excluded me to save money, to not rock the boat. That particular coldness sent a small, precise stone through the lake I'd been trying to steady. I put the brochures back in their envelope and slid them into the folder with the yacht title. The leather seemed heavier. When I brought the brochures to the breakfast table, I kept my voice even, practical, which is less threatening than loud. "Is there a reason my name isn't on this?" I asked, turning the glossy page so Ben could see. His jaw tightened for a moment in a way I had learned to read. "It was supposed to be a surprise," he said. "They didn't want to tell you because they thought you'd insist on planning too much." Claire, who had come by to pick up a vase, smiled like someone handing me a wrapped gift. "Viv," she said, "we thought it would be nicer with just family, you know, the kids and immediate people. You always do the big reunions." I remember the sound of the teapot when Ben poured tea, an everyday noise against a background of erasing 4 words from my life. You always do the big reunions. It was no longer kindness. It was a reclassification. I was support staff. I told myself to keep the conversation short. I could feel the folder in my purse like a potential key. Instead, I was offered guilt-softened lines about saving money and keeping things simple. Tom chimed in with that clipped voice of a man used to having his way. "You can come to the shore thing another weekend. Look, Viv, it's complicated. Flights, cabins." He waved his hands like the planner of other people's priorities. Then Claire did something that narrowed the room. She laughed. "Sweetheart, it's not personal. You know how expensive these cruises are." She said it with the same casual cruelty people use when explaining a truth they don't want to own. My hands tightened around the teacup. I could have asked where the money came from for the suits and the fine dinners they all took for granted. I could have listed the years of unpaid bills I'd covered, the weddings, the repairs. Instead, I stood up, very small, and said, "I have plans." I left the room. A new event. That afternoon, I checked my bank account from the kitchen and watched in that strange, clinical way as payments showed as drafts to accounts I had never signed up for at the last minute. There were automatic payments for marina upkeep that I had arranged years before. Their auto payments had been set to come from an account in my name. I had never thought to change them because who would take the trouble when everyone enjoyed the benefits? The numbers blurred because I didn't want to calculate how many more months I would keep subsidizing the illusion. Not everyone in the family felt guilty. Ben sat me down later that night, a different sort of man who suddenly wanted to soothe the waves I'd made. He said, "I didn't want to hurt you." The sentence was a broker's sentence, words traded for a cost. He explained that the family had tightened up on expenses because someone had made a bad investment and they couldn't show weakness at their social club. "It has nothing to do with you," he added. His eyes were earnest. I noticed then that he said "we" when describing finances at parties, but "I" when describing his role in our household. The compartmentalization is a thing people build brick by brick. Over the next week, the gaslighting deepened. Claire called late and accused me of making this about money. Mark texted memes about the helpful mom who loves everyone. I was told repeatedly that I had misunderstood the nature of the trip. They treated my silence as a character flaw, too sensitive, too dramatic. I caught myself wanting to stand in the doorway and put them all in their proper place, in their truth. Instead, I sat with a small, steady plan forming in me that had nothing to do with theatrics. The breaking point came in the most ordinary of places, the marina office. I went there to ask about a dock schedule for a maintenance check on the yacht. I was handed a glossy brochure for the fleet and, by habit more than other reason, I asked to see the ownership papers they kept on file. It was routine for me to check that the insurance was up to date. The assistant, a young woman with tired eyes, glanced at me and pushed across a file stamped with my name. "Everything's been in your name for years," she said, and the paperweight in my hand felt like a verdict. I read the title, the certificate of registration, the insurance policy, my name, my inheritance, an address I recognized from my old paperwork. The legal reality, quiet, immutable, sat there. The family had been living under my generosity, and when it came time to include me, they excluded me. I left the marina and drove aimlessly until I found myself at the hardware store buying small locks, nothing dramatic. I locked nothing that day, but I needed the motion. I called the accountant I had used when my mother's affairs were settled. "You know, Viv," he said after a long pause, "it's your asset. You can do what you want with it." His words were not celebratory. They were factual. Facts feel like the first cool breath after someone throws a bucket of cold water at you. That night, none of us shouted. There was no raised voice, no dramatic door slam. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and looked at the black water where the yacht rocked gently under the street lamp. Something in me folded the old way of giving into a small, severe plan. I would not fight them in the way they expected. I would not beg to be included. I would do something quieter and more final. I think the first step toward real change is physical motion, the moving of hands, the closing of drawers, a small, decisive packing. I went to the hall closet and took down the leather folder. The title to the yacht, insurance papers, my mother's will, the correspondence where I'd repeatedly told Ben I was uncomfortable funding everything. These were the things people do not expect to be relevant to feelings. I spread them on the kitchen table like cold medicine. A new event then took the shape of clarity. I called a maritime broker I had met at a charity auction years ago, a practical woman named Rachel who sold boats for a living and spoke with an expert's lack of sentiment. "If it's cleanly in your name, you can sell," she said without relish. "And you'll get buyers, summer's coming. But you must make the title available. Sign here, give me power of attorney." Her voice was efficient. It didn't say anything about punishments. Before I could second-guess myself, I arranged to meet Rachel at the marina the next morning. The decision felt like peeling off a bandage slowly and finding a bruise underneath that had been there all along. I packed a small bag that night, not to run, but to breathe. I booked myself a 2-week retreat at a small spa in Bali I had been told about by an old friend. Not because I needed to escape, but because I needed a place where no one could pull me into the role of family organizer. The booking site chirped confirmation, and the image of a quiet lotus pond filled the screen. I turned my phone to Do Not Disturb. The act of turning off a phone felt like closing a gate. It was the sound of a boundary forming. The next morning, I walked into the broker's office with the folder under my arm. There was no grand proclamation, only paperwork and signatures. Rachel explained the steps, faxed forms, made calls to a buyer who wanted a quick turnaround. I signed a power of attorney and a bill of sale that moved the title from Vivian Margot Lawrence into escrow until the buyer completed payment. It was quiet work, signatures in blue ink, a notary's stamp, the broker sliding a retainer across to my account. I felt oddly light. The sale was not revenge in the loud sense. It was the final act of a woman reclaiming what was hers. A new event unfolded when I called the bank to cancel the automatic payments tied to the marina upkeep, the yacht crew salaries I had reluctantly covered, and the yacht's insurance. I withdrew all non-essential shared funding and transferred control to an independent account. The bank teller, polite and somewhat puzzled, asked if I was sure. "Yes," I said. I did not justify myself. I simply made the decisions I had been putting off for 25 years. Packing for Bali, I put in a photograph of my mother and a simple pair of sandals. I wrote a short letter, not to be dramatic, but to note a fact, that I would not be available for the cruise, and that moving forward, I was no longer covering certain bills. I left the letter on the kitchen counter for Ben to find. I did not lock the house. I left the yard gate open, a small flourish of neutrality. I wanted my exit to be an ordinary one. The broker called from the marina while I was still in flight mode, confirming an interested buyer had placed a cash offer. "They want to keep it in the area, convert it for day charters," Rachel said. "The price is fair and they'll handle the captain contract." I listened while the plane hummed. The sale was not about humiliation. It was about consequence. I thought of the first scalloped edge of the invitation with my name left out and realized how often I had accepted being invisible. The buyer's name was not someone I knew. It was a small maritime company that specialized in local tours. They would pay, and then the dock would be cleared. I did 2 things before I left for the airport. I handed Ben an envelope with a list of bills I had been covering and the effective date I would stop, and I wrote a single line on a legal pad. "The yacht is in my name." I slipped it into the folder and into the safety deposit box, closing the lid with a thud that sounded like a decision landing. I did not shout. I did not estrange. I simply rearranged the pieces. On the plane, I turned my phone to airplane mode and watched the coastline shrink into a ribbon. For the first time in years, I slept on a long flight. When I arrived in Bali, I left my phone in the hotel safe for the first 48 hours. I sat by the pool and let the sun do what it always does, melt edges. In the quiet of the retreat, I reviewed family photos on an old album I had brought with me. There was a picture of Mom laughing on the deck, a younger me in a sundress, Ben with sea salt in his hair. Each photograph showed who we had been before money and expectations blurred the shape of our family. I felt the ache, sharp, honest, and then watched it become steadier, like a tide pulling back to reveal stones. Back in the States, the broker sent a terse email. Buyer deposited funds, all paperwork executed, captain informed. The marina manager called Ben and Claire with a routine message about mooring changes. They didn't call me because my phone was off. I watched the emails get forwarded, read the notices they forwarded to each other with worried subject lines. I watched it from across an ocean and did not interfere. I had done what I set out to do, create a boundary that meant the consequences were no longer mine to manage. The image that closed the act for me was small and domestic. As I left the spa, I folded the last sarong into my bag and placed a small paper card between two layers. It read, in Mom's handwriting on an old note I kept, "Own your days." The card fit into my passport like a talisman. I felt, for the first time in years, that owning my days might be the truest luxury. The morning they arrived at the marina, the sky was clear and cruelly ordinary. They expected the yacht to be there, polished as always, with the captain waiting and the crew cinched into uniforms. Instead, the slip was empty, sunlight on planks, and a lone dinghy tied to a piling. Ben's face flushed the color of the tide. "Where is she?" he demanded, voice equal parts confusion and entitled rage. Claire checked her phone and replayed a voicemail she had left to confirm the captain's availability. It went straight to the marina's general inbox. A new event happened fast. The marina manager, a man who had seen summers of similar dramas, produced a copy of the bill of sale from his file. "The title shows a sale," he said, handing over a crisp copy of the contract. Ben's fingers trembled when he took it. Panic has a peculiar sequencing. First there is disbelief, then calculation, then blame. They called me. First Claire, then Ben, then a string of relatives. My phone was still on Do Not Disturb. I read the messages later. "Viv, what happened to the yacht? We need it for the weekend." "Ben, call me right away." In the marina office, they watched the contract and argued with the manager about liens and authentication. I watched from afar and felt none of the gloating people sometimes mistake for joy. I felt only the quiet observation of consequences taking shape. A new event unfolded when the captain, a man named Luis, who had sailed with us since the first year, arrived breathless with news. He handed Ben an invoice for past salaries and an explanation that the captain's contract was now with the new owner. He looked at Ben with something like pity. "Madam," he said quietly when he saw the copy of the bill of sale, "the paperwork was clear. You signed it." It was not a gloating whisper. It was fact. Ben sputtered, then tried to place blame on the broker, on lawyers, on me. Claire accused the marina of a setup, called her expensive lawyer, and demanded that someone show proof of cash on hand. Within hours, the ripple became a wave. The credit cards they relied on to maintain appearances started to be examined. I had canceled auto-pays that had carried repairs and private tuition, and notices that used to be paid automatically came back to the family with late charges. An unexpected twist arrived when one of the social clubs they frequented sent a terse message, "Accounts under review." Invitations with gold-embossed cards were quietly stopped. I watched as their calendar emptied like a tide pool losing water. Gala RSVPs rescinded for unclear reasons. Private dinner bookings denied when a credit check revealed overdrafts tied to accounts they assumed someone else would cover. Another new event made the living room feel unbearably small. Zoe, their niece, who had always been blithe in her shopping, called Claire in tears because her student loan auto payment had been declined, and her financial aid auditing office was asking questions. Claire's voice hardened into denial and then desperate bargaining. "Viv, it's all a misunderstanding," she said finally, in a tone that begged for restoration rather than explanation. "We can fix this. We just need a temporary loan." They came to me online first, pleading in messages I ignored until I was ready to respond. Then they drove to my house, a convoy of minivans, arriving under my porch light like a judgment. They stood on the grass, looking sheepish and small in a way that didn't suit them. "Viv," Ben said, hands spread, "this has been a disaster. We just need to get you to sign some documents to reverse it." Claire rattled off half-formed plans to put things back in the family's name. I watched them make offers small and frantic, and in the sound of their bargaining, I heard the echo of decades where I had been the emergency fund, the one who patched holes without complaint. An unexpected twist occurred when the buyer's representative called the marina to confirm pickup and was informed of the family's distress. The representative, who had been respectful and brisk in business, declined to reverse the sale. "The purchase is final," he said. "We paid fair market value and documented the transaction." There would be no romantic rescindment. They would have to negotiate directly with the buyer if they wanted any concession. For once, the legal record was not sympathetic to entitled pleas. Beyond the financial breakdown, social consequences bloomed. The community that had once bent toward them with invitations now tilted away when invoices were late and reputations needed defending. A Mutual's board member, who had been a friend for years, asked Ben to step down from a committee after news of overdue payments circulated. It was quiet, bureaucratic punishment, but punishment nonetheless. The family who had relied on other people to make them acceptable now had to stand in the cold air of responsibility. I did not celebrate. I listened to the stories filtered through friends who called and relatives who explained their side. I watched Ben's expression age by a few years in a week. I received one message from Claire at dawn. "We are sorry. Please talk to us." I did not call back. Instead, I continued the new pattern I had started. I replied with a single line when necessary, with facts and dates. I reminded them calmly that the yacht had been bought with my inheritance, that legal documents had been executed, that my decision to sell had been conveyed through proper channels. The revenge, if anyone wanted to call it that, had its teeth because it was clean and inevitable, not because it was loud. A twist that nobody expected, least of all me, came when the captain, Luis, contacted a local reporter curious about the sudden change. He told a small, human piece of the story, that a long-suffering woman had quietly changed the ledger. The reporter liked the human element, and the story ran the next day with a headline about a quiet reclaiming. Suddenly, gossip swelled. The narrative shifted from, "How could she?" to, "How had she been overlooked?" It didn't mend everything, but it adjusted public perception. The family, who had always been good at narrative control, found themselves struggling to shape the message. Watching all this from a distance had the odd effect of making me feel like an observer of my own life. I had set an action into motion and now watched the natural consequences unfold. The yacht was gone. The payments stopped. They scrambled, they blamed, they begged. And when they came back to ask for help, I met them with the same quietness I had used to enact the change. My answer did not come with an angry speech. It came with the closing of a door. They came to my porch finally, the convoy reduced to a single car, faces more human than I had seen in months. Claire had mascara smudged. Ben looked hollowed at the temples. I opened the door and let them step into the foyer. They expected a scene, tears, recriminations, a dramatic plea. They couldn't have been more wrong. I had learned over the last months that boundaries held no drama when you choose them steady. "Please," Claire said, and for the first time I noticed the shake in her voice. "We need you. We can fix this together." She reached for my hands as if our decades of shared holidays meant anything to the bills now on their table. Ben tried a different tactic, a casual camaraderie, as if we could laugh it off over coffee. "We were careless," he said. "We didn't think you'd actually—" He stopped when I raised an eyebrow. I listened to their apologies, the rehearsed lines, the small changes of tack as they searched for a way back into a role they had taken for granted. My reply was small and deliberate. "I closed the accounts I needed to close," I said. "I signed the sale. You were offered the chance to be honest about costs, and you chose not to. No theatrics, no raised voice, just fact and finality." Claire begged for a loan. Ben suggested we work out a payment plan. I had done something new. I refused. I told them calmly that I could not be the bank for their patterns anymore. They tried to bargain, to charm, to shame. At one point, Mark tried the old line, "But we're family." I answered with another quiet fact. Family means mutual responsibility. If one person shoulders everything, that's not family. It's a one-way street. I did not rub salt into old wounds. I did not point to every bill. I set a boundary and let them face their consequences. Another new event arrived in the weeks that followed, a small postcard from Bali. I had mailed one to myself, a small ritual of returning from a retreat changed. On it, I had written a single sentence: "I am home to myself now." That card sat on the kitchen windowsill for days, catching light. I found myself making small routines I had not had time for, mowing a neat rectangle of lawn, planting a hydrangea where the old fence had been mended, making a proper cup of coffee, and sitting on the porch until the sun warmed the wood. My days filled with ordinary quiet. They called and texted. Sometimes they apologized with newness. Sometimes they asked for help, and I pointed them to resources: a financial planner, a family counselor. I did not do the work for them. I handed them numbers, names, and firm boundaries. When Zoe needed a place to study during a difficult semester, I assisted her with a referral to a campus advisor instead of sweeping her loans under my own account. It felt strange at first to refuse immediate rescue, but every time I did, I watched their reliance shrink a little. A neighbor stopped by one afternoon with a pie and a knowing smile. "You look lighter," she said. She didn't mean me to feel flattered, only acknowledged. I had been so used to carrying the family's image that I forgot how much lighter life could be when you had permission to exist for yourself. I started attending a pottery class at the community center and learned to center clay with my palms. I found that hands that once wrote checks could also shape something beautiful. Claire attempted to come by once with a bouquet of peonies, the very flowers I'd always specified for reunions. She left them on the porch mid-afternoon and then retreated. Ben sent a long email about lessons learned, about transparency and gratitude. I read it twice and filed it under "Not My Burden." They had lost a yacht, social invitations, and the buffer of my finances. What they gained was the opportunity to learn responsibility. I gained a quieter calendar and a reclaimed balance. One morning, as summer turned into the soft edges of fall, I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee and the hydrangea beginning to bloom. The harbor across the street glistened with boats that were other people's responsibilities. A small child from the neighborhood waved at a passing dinghy, and I waved back. The cap of the key ring I had used for years, one fewer key on it now, sat in a small wooden dish beside my cup. I touched the ring with a thumb, feeling the smoothness. The keys were no longer instruments of obligation, they were ordinary metal. The final note was simple and private. One afternoon, Ben came by to return a pair of sunglasses he had borrowed and forgotten. He hesitated by the gate, hands on the new fence. Are you okay?" he asked, the sentence awkward like someone stepping into cold water. I had the answer already, in the way my days had reordered themselves, gentle rituals, evenings that belonged to me, a garden that required hands. "Yes," I said, "I am." No flourish, no victory lap, just a settled, undeniable truth. I did not gloat when I heard they had to downsize the summer house. I did not celebrate when the marina posted new public rules about proof of ownership because the law had done what I had set into motion. I felt neither triumph nor cruelty. I felt settled. Healing in the end was not grand. It was the small work of living under my own terms, making tea at 9 a.m., writing a letter to a friend without copying everyone in, returning a library book before it was due. Those ordinary things felt like reconciliation with myself. A final quiet image. I sat at the kitchen table with an album open, the photograph of my mother on the deck. I picked up the old key that used to open the yacht's locker, one tiny key among a ring, and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. I did not put it on a shelf as a trophy. I kept it because it reminded me how easily I had once given away my power, and how deliberate I could be in keeping it now. Outside, the harbor breathed like a slow memory. Inside, my cup warmed my hands. I had been invisible for years, and then, with a steady hand and quiet decisions, I stopped being so.